And now Isaac. Isaac, how you doing?
Doing very good today. How are you, Andrew? Sean?
I'm well. Sean has escaped. He's run away. But your camera's good. That's good. Of course, because you've got a big channel and everything. Tell us a little bit about you and what you're all about.
Well, Science and Futurism is a show that got started about 8 years ago. We just celebrated our 8th anniversary, and it was a hobby like so many of these things start off as, and kind of grew in time to just kind of look at various topics of everything from space and science fiction concepts and how real they might be to more at-home stuff like how we could do climate repair or cybernetics or artificial intelligence. And so we basically cover every area of science and futurism we can get our hands on. That sounds like a fun episode.
I had a look at your channel before and I was loving it because I love all those big questions. And I suppose my first concern was, oh God, it's all going to be like mad stuff that isn't. But a lot of it is just, the philosophy behind what it would be like if this were true and that kind of stuff. And it all seems really, really interesting. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about, is it alien refugees? Is that right?
Alien refugees, yep.
What's an alien refugee?
Well, that's a good question. It's one of our examples of we do Sci-Fi Sunday episodes. Once a month, we kind of back down on hard science and try to take something out of sci-fi and just say, if this happened, forget about how possible it is. If it happened, what would that look like? Or how can we make that happen? And one of the most popular themes we had in science fiction is this idea that aliens might just show up out of nowhere and land on Earth, crash on a ship, and then we say, well, what do we do with them? We say it's like Alien Nation or District 9. And it turns out to be a much more complex question than one would think, because outside of science fiction, they're not going to look much like us. They probably don't breathe the same air as us. They're going to have certain valuable things, like even their discarded garbage is going to have technological leads that might be valuable for us. And all the other problem being is that anything on their ship that's biologically compatible with us might kill us instantly if it got into the environment. So there's these things that might be the hyper-invasive species. If it got hooks in, just something really tiny like one little bacteria that might divide and suddenly the ecosystem flops over a year later or so. So that's kind of how we approach this topic is, let's look at all the kind of things we see normally in sci-fi, and then let's see what we can do with them to see how realistic they are, see what the unthought of bits of it all.
It is a mad thought, isn't it? And I suppose that's true. We all see these movies and it's like, okay, you put your finger out to ET's finger and it's all very exciting. But the reality is, just like when the settlers from Europe went to, or colonists from Europe went to the Americas, they could be bringing all sorts of bugs that might wipe us out, right?
Whether it's a small little virus or, some little pathogen, or I think what's the example from Australia, rabbits. They had the rabbits get loose in Australia. And there's, these things happen naturally to some degree, but usually when the animal or whatever it is comes across the natural form, their predators and other bits are with them. It's a slow progress. When you mass import them, it becomes a much bigger issue. And you get so many side questions like, well, if they did land, I think in Alien Nation, they landed in the Mojave Desert, and then District 9, they landed in South Africa, and say, well, they landed there. What does everybody else do? What if they landed in North Korea? What would we do about that? Would a country, let's imagine they decide to poke down somewhere in Siberia right now. What's that actually look like in terms of folks at the UN or otherwise saying, we'd like to talk to these people? No, we'll keep them for ourselves. Who gets that technology? And then
North Korea would steal or Russia would steal all the information.
How defenseless are they? Is it genuine and sincere? Are they being chased by someone? And if so, do we want to get involved in that? Because it probably isn't going to look good for us,
Yeah, because you philosophize about whether, they might be running from people, right? Who might they be running from?
Well, if we're assuming they're going slower than light, there's a chance that they might be, fleeing from themselves. It might be a civil war or something like that, in which case it might be the equivalent of like the War of Roses is coming to an end, and the losing factions decide to come visit us. And it'd be a bit like that too, because the nearest place might be 300 years of travel away. So you don't really know what that looks like diplomatically anymore. They might have been horrible, horrible people who were fleeing one step ahead of the guillotine too. They might have been, the worst exiles you can imagine. But after 300 years on a ship, maybe you're talking to their descendants who have this rose-colored image of them and all themselves actually very nice. Or they might have turned very nasty and piratic in the meantime, even though they were the noble fleeing rebels, And those little bits that we do on the show that tend to, I think they add a little bit of flavor to other stories, but they also make us think realistically about how these scenarios might play out. So if aliens do show up tomorrow, however likely that might be, we at least have some idea what we probably want to ask. You know.
Yeah, I can see why your channel's so popular. This is kind of, I suppose it's, what is it? I'm not sure which word I'm supposed to use, but like a smoking, after having smoking sessions, or it's quite a nerdy conversation, which I love having. I can have these for hours. And also tell me, where's your accent from? Because I'm hearing a Texas thing.
It's a bit of a mix of a speech impediment with a little bit too much travel. I spent probably too much time as a kid getting exposed to New England and BBC voices, and then I had some time in the military, and everyone in the U.S. Army develops a South Georgia accent, so it kind of like follows together. But I couldn't pronounce R's for the longest time, or any of the other glides like world, which always has a bit of a non-erotic dialect like you see from New England, for instance. And then I got some therapy for that, and I expected to go away completely and just have a normal voice as you'd expect from somebody who lives in Northeast Ohio. And they said, well, you got a bit of that accent, but you got something else in there too. It's an actual accent, not just an impediment. I said, okay, what is it? I said, well, we've been talking about that with a few other experts, and they say it's mid-Atlantic. I said, mid-Atlantic. Yes. Isn't that the kind of that fake one that people put on? So you're good. All right, works for me.
Oh, it's one of my favorite accents, though. I was picking up on that, and then I was getting a little bit of and I hope you don't mind me analyzing your accent. I just love accents. And I was getting a little bit of I do declare. I was getting a bit of that sort of thing, but then also the Mid-Atlantic I was getting, which is
I
great.
think there's so many dialects that do the softer R's that it's easier to speak, and if you don't do R's very well, they tend to stick with me a little bit more. So that bit of the Southern one, bit of the New England one, bit of the British one, bit of every other place. And usually it sounds like, it's somebody who speaks English as their native language, but you can't quite figure out where you're from. So
it's a wonderful accent. I love it. I think you speak very beautifully.
When I first started doing the show, because again, I had not expected to become a show. It was just a hobby, a fun topics to talk with. He was explaining these science concepts to sci-fi authors in a lot of cases. And I thought, well, if this catches off, I'll just hire a narrator. And my audience at the time, because it started growing, says, don't you dare. This is the voice we're used to. It's like, okay, well, then I guess I'll go get speech therapy instead.
Well, people obviously like your voice. Anyway, I better get back onto the aliens, right? How do we determine if these aliens are being honest? What kind of ways can we do that?
I think a lot of times by asking what their request would tend to be. And in other episodes, we talk more about space colonization and the realism of it. We start finding out things like you're probably much more likely than terraforming planets like Mars or Venus. You might do these, but more often you would build a space habitat that was kind of more to your actual taste. Like the day on Mars is a half hour too long, and the gravity is about 60% too weak. Venus, the day is about 300 to 200 days too long, and the temperature is, very warm. They used to think it was paradise planets, and then they found out the beautiful clouds of it were made of acid. So you can terraform a place like that, or you can make a gigantic habitat that's really, kind of a constructed ecology where you just rotate it to produce the gravity that rate you want, the day length at the rate that you want, or any number of other options that might come up technologically if, for instance, you just get something like artificial gravity. And so we think, why would the aliens be fleeing here? Our ecosystem is not going to be anything like theirs. And you don't necessarily want to open your arms up, but you might get an incident like Man of Steel, where the aliens arrive like, well, we're here, we'd like to terraform your planet to our needs. And so I said, well, how can we replicate what they need for their environment? But if they're coming to visit, the most likely scenario is they are coming here, why? For sanctuary. They want us to protect them. I don't think we have big enough guns to repel a giant space fleet right now. Maybe they're hoping that if they give us the technology for it, we might build that. And then the question is, do we actually want to help these people? How do we know? How open are they being with us about these things? If they've been able to study our radio waves for a century while they came in, there's a good chance they can play us like a book, whereas we know what they feed us. We might not even know what they look like. They look like cute little furry aliens, as depicted in the best Pixar movie that they were able to find, and then they actually show up and they got like 50 tentacles and scale Cthulhu.
Oh my god!
Although those might actually be the friendly aliens too.
I was hearing recently that it's unlikely they've even heard our radio waves if there are aliens out there, just because they would be so far beyond radio, most likely.
Well, the thing is, they might have some technology that's better than radio, and without even going to new physics, they might just use tight beam communication. Laser beams do spread out as they go through space. It's just that they spread out a lot thinner, so you can use a much longer distance. So you just aim for the place you want to speak to, and it's going to show up like a flashlight, that kind of range saves power. But even then, they're still probably using electromagnetic signals. If they're not, they still know that we are. If they have some means of doing faster than light travel, then there's no reason why they couldn't be dropping off probes that can hear radio waves in every solar system they can think of. It sounds a bit weird, but even with almost 1 trillion stars in this galaxy, any kind of interstellar civilization shouldn't have any problems putting a probe right around every single planet to just take a direct look like a satellite recon would. At the same time, they should be able to spot planets before we ever send any radio waves out. We're not looking right now for alien radio signals as much as we used to. We're focused more on that little signature says there's oxygen. So there shouldn't be that much free oxygen in the environment. And this is a good example of how we constantly have to redefine what we think all leads, all common sense in anything involving aliens, but certainly in terms of the future in general, which is always that thing that seems really obvious to us now as a certainty. When we get a little bit of new technology, somebody says, well, that's absolutely not how things are going to happen after all. We think of the robot vacuum cleaner on the Jetsons. It's a robot pushing a vacuum cleaner. And we say, well, it needs to be small enough to have a conversation with us, so it's got to be pretty smart. And of course, then we find out that you don't really need to make a machine smart enough to understand human directions. You need to make a human smart enough to understand the machine's programming so you can just make it do its job. You don't need to really tell the blender to operate. You need to know how to push the button. And it's got its job. And the same for the Roomba or the mop, etc. So, which is another area we look at a lot of times. If it's alien, there's a good chance it's not actually biological. It might be alien artificial intelligence. And we don't know how they might show up, but you have to look through the various options that could go on for them. Like if they're an alien robot, they don't really care about the environment at all. That shouldn't matter to them that much. They're just some place they can set up power collectors at. On the flip side of that is that if they are robots, right, then do they really want to talk to us, or would they like to talk to Google instead?
Yeah, and now robots curious. I suppose what you were just saying made me think about the Fermi Paradox. You were talking about, it shouldn't be so difficult for an alien civilization, particularly if they've had millions of years to develop, to be able to search for radio waves everywhere. And for those who don't know what that is, well, maybe you could explain the Fermi Paradox and where you stand on that.
Well, the Floyd Paradox, and it's probably one of the most popular topics on the show, is the very basic idea that the universe is huge and ancient, 13, 14 billion years old, and so huge that it makes our galaxy look like a little dot and our planet look like an atom-sized speck. And it's enormous, and it's ancient, and it's full of planets, and it doesn't seem to have any obvious aliens all over the place. At least we don't seem to see that right now. It's debatable at the very least, and we don't know where they are. And we tend to think they should be everywhere. If they've been around for billions of years, they should have colonized every rock. The alien equivalent of Starbucks should be everywhere, And yet we don't see them. So we say, well, what could be some reasons for that? And you got the kind of the rare earth camp that says, well, the conditions needed for life are probably rare, and the conditions needed for intelligence are probably rare. And you have the camp that says maybe intelligence is common, but they blow themselves up a lot, and you can't travel between the stars. And you have a number of other camps that say they are here all the time, and we're just really blind and stupid about it. Or that we don't recognize them because they're a sentient cloud, and they're not really looking to talk to us because they're a sentient cloud.
What's a sentient cloud?
Yeah, sentient cloud could just be something floating through space that's one very slow giant mind, and we look like a mayfly to it because we only live a century as it takes that long to blink its eye. Those are the kind of weirder options you get with that. We only know one way that life can really evolve right now, but there could be a lot of others. And that's the problem with the Floyd Paradox is just sheer immensity. The universe says there should be something, but at the same time we say if there is, why aren't they around? And to Fermi himself, it was no paradox. He helped make the atom bomb, and there was no space race when he died. It hadn't happened yet. So he just assumed that space travel to other worlds was virtually impossible, and that civilizations tended to blow themselves up first. Post-moon landing, the guy who coined the term Fermi Paradox, who was Michael Hart, he said that since we had successfully traveled to at least the nearest world, the moon, and we hadn't blown ourselves up in the meantime, there was a decent chance some people would survive. And since there's a biological urge to colonize space, if it's possible, they probably will. And that's where we start getting into so many problems of it's not the idea that our alien homeworld might be, 100,000 light years away. It's that their colony might be 10 light years away. That's how far away they are because they just fill up space. It's not where the original amoeba on Earth expanded from. It's the fact that it only probably needed a few thousand years to expand over the entire planet. So you really don't expect life to emerge one place in a galaxy before it had a chance to pretty much be all over the place. That's the kind of nonsense concept behind the grabby aliens notion, which is actually our episode for tomorrow on the show.
Oh, cool.
So, but I think the biggest thing with a lot of the alien examples that we come up with in these is how we would interact with them. We so often assume that they'd have faster than light travel and communication, and the problem there is we're not sure if we could hear their radio signals from 100 light years away. There are ways that can make really loud ones you can hear galaxies away just using known science, but it takes a lot of power. But the game changes if they suddenly have faster light travel, but it only makes the Fermi Paradox way worse, because if it's that easy to travel through space and to send signals through space, you should be able to coordinate huge empires and build them very quickly, and they also don't seem to be there.
And so what does that leave us with? We're alone?
I tend to think that tends to be where I land at myself. But the after years of doing this, I say the strongest, or I should say least weak camp, is the idea that intelligent life is probably just very rare. Nobody else in our galaxy yet, and maybe no one in our supercluster. Though our supercluster is also small. It contains around 1 million galaxies, and there's about 10 million of those in the universe too. So even something that big is tiny in the universe. So there might be 1 million alien civilizations out there, each with 1 million galaxies apiece. So that would still be pretty populated. But that to me has always been the strongest one, or at least weak. None of them really work ideally. I've never heard a solution posed for the Fermi Paradox that didn't have holes in it.
I suppose it is just like you say, it's so rare. I should just say that there are people in the chat. There's a running joke that Sean started that I'm a cyborg or some such thing, because there's a hole at the back of my hair, like alopecia, and that's where they plug me in. And so I think some people are making the joke, and just others who are I think others are actually genuinely concerned. I promise I'm not making your phone hot or any of your devices warmer than they may usually be. That's unrelated to me, although I can't speak for Isaac, who might be doing that.
It was long assumed I was an artificial intelligence on the show, which admittedly I did tend to play up a bit. So
isn't it amazing, the stuff that some people, I mean, obviously some people are joking around. I do have a question from Ray J for Isaac. Do you think all the alien stuff is in the Bible, just distorted to suit their need for control?
Well, I suppose we're trying to who they was in that case. I'm not the best scholar of either the New or Old Testament, but to the best of my knowledge, there's really not too much discussion there that would discuss other planets. I've certainly seen people who have discussed that in, say, context things like Nephilim or other things, but you'd have to talk to a priest or a rabbi or a minister that's more focused on that to really get anything in terms of scriptural quotations. But I would say, and I know the Quran has some mention of this too, and certainly a lot of the Eastern religions, that kind of the concept comes up of life from other worlds. And you could say that even about things like Norse mythology, it's in there. I don't know that indicates that anyone from those places came and visited us and told us about them, or just that we are clever people who are prone to wander both in body and mind, so that we don't have any problem picturing new places to be. So I couldn't give you a definitive answer on that one way or another, of course.
Let's go back to this initial idea, I suppose, of aliens coming here. How might we benefit from them arriving on our planet?
I mean, usually the big one, of course, is that if somebody from right now crashed back in the 1800s on a magic spaceship, their cell phone is full of technology. And while we might say, well, no one in the 1800s could possibly figure that out, and there'd be some amount of truth to that, there's a lot they could figure out from that. And there's a lot that they could, people often don't realize how simple scientific advances are and how easy they are to get once they get them. A lot of us who go through like physics, for instance, we're getting related training to some of the higher concepts, but we don't know about some specific invention or something. And I don't know anyone in my field who hasn't, some story about how they thought up this one really cool idea out of the blue that would be worth millions, and they found out somebody had already invented it. It's like, oh. But it wasn't plagiarized. So maybe you came across it by accident, but more likely you've had that more advanced training, and so the idea came to you very naturally. A lot of sophisticated technology is incredibly simple once something's put you on the center of that trail. And so an alien device, even just seeing how the thing flies without knowing any of the specifics, could potentially work out that way. That's why, with an example of alien conquerors, if they show up, they're going to beat us just horribly. It would not even be a contest. Just because they can fly across space, there's that much energy valve. But if they're occupying us, much like us occupying some colony that was, low tech at the beginning, even Neolithic, you only need a generation or two before they start figuring stuff out in detail because they're exposed to it constantly. And then the peyote changes because technology is not a good measure of a society's ethics, nor is it really something that sticks to you very long. It's just there, and we tend to mystify technology a bit because our culture is so built around it. But there is very little that we use on a day-to-day basis where you couldn't talk and explain to someone who's got decent scientific principles a basic of how that thing operates in short order. Although there's a lot of things that I don't know if I could understand. There was someone spent an entire day telling me, so a little bit of both.
I'm just wondering, so then if they came down here and we got some of their technology, but as you say, it doesn't give us much idea about their ethics. I suppose we'd like to think that compared to maybe the Columbus days and the colonizing days, that if they're that advanced technologically, that they might have some kind of ethics involved and some sort of, I suppose, I know you say there's no link to but maybe there is a link. If they're that advanced, maybe they don't want to hurt us. They'd see us as like people, not to hurt.
We have this idea sometimes that there is a core fundamental morality. And I personally like that idea. I like the idea that there is a genuine right or wrong. I can't prove that. I can't prove I have free will either, but I work from that assumption in the meantime. And if there is such a thing as a core fundamental right and wrong, then it should be something anybody could figure out. And if that's the case, then a lot of things about what should I do in this situation? What is the right answer to the trolley problem, or whether you should run people over or switch on a track and run one person over, those existential issues. If those have real correct answers, they know them too. And that would be the morality everybody in the universe presumably used once they got to a certain point. On the other hand, that's a lot of assumptions in there and a lot of generosity. And the flip side of that is you have to say, what do we know about them from them getting here? And I would not say that it's wrong to go flee to other people when you need help. But if you're traveling hundreds of light years around many empty star systems, because the vast majority of space is empty, as best as we can tell, and when your civilization doesn't want to live on Earth anyway, but maybe some space habitat that could build an asteroid, why come here? And what does that tell us about them? And say, well, maybe they're coming from some space empire that has a rule about not messing around with primitive civilizations, so they can claim sanctuary here the same as one of us might claim it in Monaco or some other country that our home nation could step on like a bug, but won't do it. Maybe that's the reason why they came here. We can protect them if we give them permission to stay. Other than that, though, the only thing I could think of is they're hoping that either A, we'll distract the enemy while they run some war. It's like, here's this new civilization that would like to go to war with you. We'll sneak out the back door while you're pounding them in the dust. Or they're hoping to convince us to come in and join their side, which might not be unethical. I mean, it could be that they are running from something horrible like the Borg from Star Trek, and they're just giving us some advanced notice of a conflict we got to get involved in anyway. Or it might be something where they're planning to feed us into the meat grinder on their behalf.
Oh my word. What if they're just curious? I'm being optimistic. They're just curious and they think they can learn in the way that we can learn from looking at different sort of primitive animals that we don't know about yet. We want to learn and study them.
And that's a fair point too, is in some ways, if they're a guest here, if they're traveling across interstellar space for potentially centuries to get here, in some ways they kind of are a refugee. If they came here intentionally and with only a temporary stay in mind, it's like a scholar, because they are far from home. They have no family or friends other than those who are brought with them. And they're basically going to have to try to make a home here, if they're just studying. And it does raise that question of how do you do anthropology in space? Because we look at Star Trek and we say, oh, they probably don't like to interfere. I say, I don't know any anthropologists who do that. They just don't like to grossly interfere. They don't hide. They show up and like, tell me about your ways. They're like, I'm not here. Ignore me. So they've come here and they like to study us. And we say, that's good. We'd like to know who you we'd like something in return, like to study you. We want to know about what you've got going on. And I think when alien shows up and says, well, I can't tell you about my home civilization or share with you any of our technologies, I'd be inclined to say, well, there's the door. You'll leave by the same door you came in.
Yeah.
Because why would they do that? They've got the ability to cure cancer, for instance. How are we really harmed as a society by getting that? You'd expect them to share something. And we do this. It's not like when all guys go in and they say, well, we like these things. We don't just say, well, I'm going to randomly start dropping off cell phones here, but we do answer their questions usually back. They're welcome to join society as opposed to told that they cannot. We're just saying it's their choice, not ours.
But if they're tough negotiators, whoever's doing that negotiating, suppose it's Biden or some world leader, I don't know, and then they say, well,
terrifying to think who might do that.
But if they say, well, you're not going to share stuff with us, then there's the door. You'll forever be remembered as the president who just lost the aliens forever.
Absolutely. And all the other world leaders are going to be like, hey, come on over here too. So there's another one of those realism aspects. I can say, you should, if they come by and offer stuff and they're not willing to actually share anything back with you just tell them to go away. But some countries are going to say yes, aren't they? I mean, surely someone will. Yeah, they can just do it to thumb their nose at us. They're going to do it.
Yeah. We've got the aliens.
Be the first one in on that deal. It's exclusive.
Yeah, they may not be teaching us anything, but we've got them. Damn it, God. So go on. Sorry, what were you going to say?
In a case like that, what do we do if, let's say they're landing and say, well, all we want is to land. We can't promise you that all the stuff in all labs and all farms on board our ship aren't going to run crazy on your environment. We'd just like to claim a little bit of ocean space and land around you. And you say, well, don't land yet. We need to look through this and do some tests. They say, well, no, we're landing. Who will let us land? And let's say some countries say, oh, you can come here. And well, what do we tell them? It's like, if you let that ship land, we're going to nuke you. Your options are kind of limited in a case like that. I mean, that because it could go there pretty quick. If there is something on board that ship which would just be lethal to us, unintentionally or not, you're letting somebody arrive here who unintentionally could have something that makes the Black Plague look like a cold, and you haven't had a chance to test this out yet. And so, I mean, what is the urgency too? If they traveled all this way, outside of an FTL universe, they spent centuries traveling. Why do they need to suddenly land in the next hour or 2 or days? They can go into orbit, and we can say, "You're welcome to set solar collectors. Do not land on this planet." And then we should have had people.
Do you think there are people in government, in defense and stuff, who are thinking things like what you're saying right now, just in case, on the very unlikely chance that it happens?
Probably a fair enough. I could actually name a couple that I know I've talked about topics with this before, like Peter Garrettson. I cannot remember what his specific role with Space Force was when they were going on it, but he had introduced me to them. So I had the pleasure of speaking at the U.S. Air Force Academy as a guest lecturer during COVID, and also to work with some of the folks who were setting up Space Force back when that was going on. And they do ask questions a little less like that. I mean, they ask those as side notes, but that's not the main topics. They're more on what would you do if someone tries to steal your satellite or takes a cargo ship or passenger ship hostage on their way to the moon. But they do think about things like that. That's only off, in recess breaks, etc. Yeah, they go there too. They've grown up on the same sci-fi movies the rest of us have. So
yeah, well, speaking of sci-fi movies, when you said about the countries all sort of being maybe against one another and negotiating and stuff, it reminded me of Arrival. That's one of my favorite movies, and they all start to have problems because China disagrees with some of the other countries and all that. And I suppose that's a real possibility if aliens were to come here.
And it could draw us together or could push apart. And some folks will say, well, surely in the face of something as, if so alien, we would draw together. But the mistake people tend to make sometimes is forget that it's not that which is very different from us that drives us nuts. We usually get along very well with people who live far away from us that have nothing in common. It's our siblings and next door neighbors we most want to punch. And so if aliens show up, you could easily have them, pick sides in a conflict, and everyone just, is cheerfully, hey, look, the aliens are on our side. So that proves to you we're on the right because they're not even from our planet. They're not biased.
Yeah,
the aliens join sides with these aliens.
The aliens believe in gender ideology or something. So now that's a thing.
Well, they might show up with 3 different types of actual genders, and yet say they'd be very understanding of our modern perspective on these things, and it turns out that they are not, or vice versa. We don't know what the things would translate well over for them, and generally tends to take the view that even if aliens are relatively nearby us, you probably wouldn't have a lot of Star Trek cases where you have Spock born of both a human and a Vulcan, or the pretty looking aliens from this or that film that look very human but not quite. They're probably not going to be least bit attractive to each other. They're not likely to really want to spend time with each other, and odds are the only people who really want to interact with them are either scientists or anthropologists, and everybody else is just that empire we try to think about because they're so nice. They gave us so many things. They helped us with so many of our technological problems. And they keep telling us that the biggest way we should fix the birth control problem that we have is do what they do, which is to kill 1/10 their children when they turn 2. Because that's just what they've always done, and it works fine. You know?
Man, that's a good point.
Something weird like that could happen. You know,
something I never thought about, because I'm so excited by the idea, and I think most people are. The idea that aliens might arrive. It's almost a religious need, a need to fill a void or to find something exciting beyond the things we've already known about. And I never thought about how, like, okay, the first few days, most exciting thing ever, and as we find out more stuff, really exciting. But then I might be like in a room with just like a random alien guy who's just like the normal, you know, he's not the president.
He's not a great poet or scientist. He's the guy who fixes the garbage machine.
Yeah, what am I going to say to that? I'd be like, oh, fuck, trying to like speak their language. I'd be really bored, and that would be boring, unfortunately.
Be horribly boring, and he's not going to get basketball because there's only 5 hoops involved in the game, and he likes to have games that have at least 20 different hoops, and we don't have enough eyeballs really to play it right anyway. So you know,
yeah, it would start
it's
to get really...
those little differences. They're not going to be overlapping as much.
Yeah, people could really... I suppose the good thing about, I mean, it was quite fortunate with like race. There was a whole while, a few hundred years ago, or only 100 years ago, really, where people thought different races had, you know, vastly different genetics that made them either superior or inferior. And it was quite a lucky thing, I suppose, that it turned out not to be true, because if it was, we'd have a whole hierarchy and stuff. But with aliens,
the caste system too. But with them, it could be true. Yeah. And what's more,
what'd you say?
With all colonists. Well, with aliens, it could very easily be true. But, we could have that with our own colonists too. I mean, you settle a planet that's 100 light years away. It takes 100 years to send them a copy of your newest movies and books. There's constantly be a flow back and forth data-wise, but alien, you know, you have humans landing on another planet, even without bringing genetic engineering or cybernetics into it. How long do you live on a planet that has different gravity and different sunlight from this planet before you start being noticeably different in culture and for long in body? And, you know, by the time you colonize a galaxy, there might not have been any aliens when you started off, but there are now, because these guys live 1 million, you know, years of travel away, and they've been separated from you for 10 million years of genetic engineering and actual normal diversity. They don't look like you anymore. You know, the folks back on Earth don't look terribly human anymore, and nobody looks like them or their neighbors.
What a weird thing that would be. It's a great thing to think about. I suppose a lot of people imagine that, I mean, there's a lot of talk about UAP, which is the new word for UFOs. A lot of people imagine that UFOs or aliens in the UFOs might actually already be here, perhaps in sort of invisible, you know, just watching, and not, you know, like a I suppose we talked about anthropologists, but the type that, you know, animal anthropologists who film stuff and try not to get involved. Maybe that's what they're doing.
Yeah, I never liked the idea of that job, because you see some cute little lion cubs. Like, I know they're going to get dusted. Why? How can you just leave them there like that? But, you know, of course, the wildebeest are kind of grateful that you did. But I think it's a difficult one in that kind of context to say, what should you do if you're an alien who comes across some planet like that? And part of you says, well, I should leave it alone. You say, well, I'm a civilized person. I survived. You know, I'm from the modern times. I know you don't just bump into someone's civilization and screw around. You say, well, what are you going to do? Sit there for 1 million years putting a quarantine on that planet? Because you might run into people where they are 1,000 years behind us now. That's great, but that would be really lucky. More likely, you run into somebody who's like, hey, we just discovered fire in 1 million years, we might get pottery. Or they haven't got opposable thumbs and they're very intelligent, but they're never going to get fire. What's a planet for dolphins and whales, and they're never going to get fire? There'll be, you know, billions of years before we were around. They've already got brains. Smarter than us, but they were just stuck there and they don't really think about colonizing space. You know, those are those tricky questions that there aren't good answers to, but you have to look at them from the standpoint of practical. And we say, well, we should not do anything on that planet other than absorb it, and say, that's great. You've been absorbing it for 100,000 years now, and you're the Federation. We'll use Star Trek as such a great example. Presumably, you don't actually hide that these places exist. I mean, it seems like a free society. You wouldn't really be redacting something as big as the existence of an entire culture. So that's out there. What were you doing to stop people who want to come by and do something else? You know, blow up their ship? What about the anthropologists who went a little bit off the reservation towards what you're supposed to do? You going to shoot them? What if they decide I'm going to cure this disease these people have and say, well, we want to avoid the tampering there. So I don't see that we have any choice but to do some orbital bombardment on the continent in which those natives were at, so as to avoid tampering with the civilization on the other side of the planet when it spills over that they've been given pottery, you know?
Yeah.
And so a lot of times what we think of as the good answers from sci-fi, and this is why we have speculative fiction in any area, is to kind of think these things through and say, at first glance that made sense, and then at second glance, it not so much. How do you quarantine a planet for 1,000,000 years? How many billions of dollars are you spending per year for 1,000,000 years to put war fleets around someplace? And how much do you trust them?
Well, I just thought I think South Park have done this, and Rick and Morty as well. That it's a reality show called Earth, and they're all watching it on their different like alien around the galaxy. And then there's the other idea I think from South Park, and I presume in literature before that, that once you reach a certain level of technology, you're welcomed. You get like a letter from the alien world, and you're welcomed into it. Earth becomes one of the trusted planets.
And it's a question to say is, I think. And I bash on Star Trek a lot. So, but one of the examples, they contact people when they get warp drive. You say, well, what's special about warp drive? How does that make them more civilized? I say, well, it doesn't. It's just that point in time, they're going to discover things anyway. Say, why do we get in touch with you and invent the radio? Well, you're going to start overhearing our conversation soon anyway. So once we hear you on there, we figure, let's go ahead and do this now for, minimal damage, and that's certainly a very good option. But I don't know that Rick and Morty really covers very well how alien contact happens. They are a universe where everyone always been contacted besides Earth. Yeah. But it is often surprising how good shows like Futurama or Rick and Morty or South Park are sometimes at handling sci-fi issues or science for that matter, or just culture. But I think with a lot of these cases, there is that question of why did they wait? What was special about us now that lets us be welcomed in that wasn't special about us when Marconi, invented the radio, or when, for that matter, we just invented agriculture. When we started looking up at the skies and looking at these things, why didn't they step in then? And it's a kind of a hard question. Is on the one hand, it seemed kind of odd to be like, hey, everybody who's died since you decided to see us but not do anything is kind of on your head. And I said, well, that's not really fair. And I say, all right, but at the same time, why are we now special, and why are you welcoming us into your community? And I think it's a lot easier sometimes to say, if we're in a zoo, and this is the zoo hypothesis, the idea that we are on display for them or in a quarantine until they have time to deal with us or until we evolve enough, we shouldn't assume that the universe around us has us as a tiny little piece of it as the zoo. We should probably more accurately assume that the universe as we see it is the zoo, not the place where the other aliens and caretakers live. And it sounds insane because there's so much universe, but to the best of our knowledge, the observable universe is not the edge of the universe. There could be an infinite amount of it out there. Nor do we have any idea if to sufficiently advanced technology, they might say, oh, we found a planet with basic life on it. What should we do with that? Throw it into a pocket universe and set off a big bang. And we can talk to them in a few trillion years when they get involved. That might be their approach to these things. Or, one method of preserving civilizations that's most effective, if you really want to protect them, is what you do is you find this planet full of basic life, humans in whatever state, and you kill them all, and you digitally upload their brains into computers, and you upload them into a virtual universe, another pocket universe, and then you can do whatever you want with that planet, including turning it into hard drives and solar power for them. And you take them back on a hard drive to your main empire where they can be protected beside a billion ship-line armada. And say, well, would we even know if they did that? If they landed and just, they infected everybody with little nanobots that could copy their brain, and then at one moment they flip them, and you wake up, you say, well, I that was weird. Well, I must need to sit down real quick and a drink of water. I feel like the whole world tilted for a second there. Maybe I should see the doctor. Nope, everything looks fine. Universe is as it normally is. Nothing to see here. Did that bird just fly by twice? No, all is well. We encounter anomalies all the time, so they're probably going to be able to handle it. And the other cool thing about digital situations, like with the Matrix, we see all these people living in virtual reality, is when you're not in a tank, when you're actually a hard drive or an uploaded person, or if they got good enough brain control anyway, you can't ever find out that you're in the Matrix, because if everyone suddenly figures out there was a problem or there was an incident that made the thing look off for a moment, they just hit the pause button and go back to the last save state. They can also put little algorithms in your brain that say, if they suddenly get too suspicious about how real things are, they're going to suddenly hit a little red flag, and we send a signal saying, you know what I'd like right now? A beer. Or, that wasn't real, or maybe I should see a psychologist. Or you just suddenly say, no, I wasn't suspicious at all, because they just changed what you were thinking. So the problem with a lot of these new things is if we're in one, the only thing I could think of would be if we've been placed in one for the purpose of trying to prepare us to consciously come to the realization we're not necessarily in a real one, so that we'd be comfortable when we emerge into the wider galaxy, or universe, which might look nothing like space around us. It might be utterly different. Might not even be three-dimensional.
That's a scary thought as well. But the Matrix one, I've often heard that people say, I can't remember what is it that people say that's like something like, why didn't they just use batteries instead of humans for batteries? Is that what they say?
I mean, they did one with the Matrix. I think the original plot they'd been using them for processing power, something like that. But either way is not very good. Humans I think in the movie it says, using humans' bioenergy in conjunction with a limited form of fusion, which it's just kind of like using this incredibly inefficient negative source that you'd have to dump energy into, along with the best power source ever. They are able to generate power. And if anything happens to that incredible crappy system of power they were using, they could never fall back on the infinite source of power they already have. So,
it made no
sense. I like
sense,
the idea where they said they were keeping us around as kind of the as kind of a creative processing center, but even that doesn't really make a lot of sense. It just at least makes some sense. Just a computer ad for creativity for the Matrix. But it was a good first movie. I enjoyed the visuals in the second movie, and the third movie I joined the army the next day. So not because it was that good. It was the last film I saw before I had to leave for boot camp.
Oh, was it? Yeah, it wasn't brilliant. The second two I didn't think were brilliant. But so tell me some other stuff that you've obviously been looking into on your channel that's really, really fascinating. And one is thinking about the civilizations at the end of time and black hole farming. So tell us a bit about that.
That was one of our original really popular episodes that I never thought anyone was actually going to watch. There was like 6 other episodes that kind of led up to the topic, and I thought, well, without having seen these, no one's going to enjoy this episode, so it'll probably just be buried off in the corner. And it turns out to be our most popular episode for years. The idea being that we always think that one day the sun's going to burn out, and we'll go live around another sun, and that will burn out eventually too. And there'll be a period of time when stars stop happening for a while, and then that'll be it. And then we'd say, well, everything runs down eventually. I said, well, that's still going to be true in something like a black hole, but according to Stephen Hawking's theory of these things, which we can't prove yet, but the math works well for it, black holes slowly evaporate. They slowly lose energy. And the smaller they are, the faster they lose energy. And the really, really small ones, the ones that wouldn't even occur naturally, but you might be able to make, or which the bigger ones will eventually turn into, can release a lot of energy. They become wonderful power reactors. And it's the most energy efficient source you can get. It's even better than fusion, which is what the stars run on, and inefficiently. Most stars don't even use 1/10 of their fuel supply. This thing would use that entire fuel supply and be 100 times more efficient in the process. So you got a black hole that's got 100 times the mass of our sun in it, and when it slowly evaporates, it's going to give off something like 100,000 times the actual energy that our sun would have done. So even feeding our dead sun's corpse into it would be, 100 times more efficient than that sun would ever have been, or 1,000 times more efficient. And the idea then was that after all the stars start dying off, and after we're done using that way, and maybe even before, because we might move those stars into black holes, we just make various black holes of various slightly staggered sizes and live off of them. You make power while you dump the energy down them. It's about 20% mass energy efficient to dump matter down there versus 1% fusion. So it's 20 times better just doing that. And then you make that long time deposit, and you eventually get your interest back in a trillion years. So this is the idea that civilizations might run in this period after stars, and not just some little meager civilization that is the remnant, kind of hanging out in the barren tundra of a dying universe, but rather that would be when almost everything of interest really happened, because that would be where 99.999% of the living happened. It's just be as much more energy abundant time in terms of efficiency. And here's the other big one: in a post-digital civilization, a post-biological civilization, a digital one, things kind of run on computation. How efficient your computation is how efficient your brains run for all practical purposes. And we have a thing called Landauer's limit, which says that where classic computation is concerned, the colder it is, the more efficient it is. So if you make something half the temperature, it will process twice as efficiently. You'll get twice as much processing for the same amount of energy. So the universe, as it expands, keeps getting cooler and cooler and cooler. And as long as your background is colder than your engine, whether it's a black hole or a star or just a regular chemical one, it's capable of making energy. So when the place is running at a millionth of a degree Kelvin, it's going to be a billion times more efficient than right now. Well, if you got 1,000 times the fuel efficiency on these things anyway, because you're running through a black hole as opposed to just casual fusion, and you got 1,000,000 times the energy efficiency, they are a billion times more efficient, a billion times more thinking done for each little bit of energy. And so that's a lot of thinking, and that's a lot of living. So, and it's spread over a huge period of time anyway. And that's kind of the notion behind these universes at the end of time, these civilizations at the end of time, is that even though we think of it as the period in which, if there's anything left at all, it's just a few, colonies hanging on, like at the end of things, like we see at I think there's one episode of Doctor Who where they're at the end of the universe and there's just a few humans left over waiting to travel wide some new universe on the last remnant of Earth 100 trillion years from now. And that's how we picture the end of the universe, is this little collapsing thing at the end. This says the other way around. These are huge empires that dwarf galactic scale ones, let alone planets. And what's more, because of how black holes evaporate, they don't shrink out in energy. They expand and blow up. So there's no slow fire dwindling off. It's not death by ice, it's death by fire. Instead, it gets brighter and brighter and brighter and explodes. And so I think you have a lot of those civilizations, they just say, well, you're your wealthiest, your most energy right before the end. And then as the end, there's a big party that last day and you're gone. After having millions of years of ramp up where things just keep getting better and better in terms of energy production. And, is that the future we'll have? No, but it's something that science tells us is at least physically possible. And that could be how things are going.
So just to make sure I've understood right, you can throw matter into a black hole and that gives you back energy.
Oh, yeah, lots. It depends on the angle you throw it in at. And it's not the matter that actually gets into the black hole. It's as it's just about getting down there, it forms an accretion disk around it. And that is just full of things hitting each other at near light speed. There's so much radiation being given off by those that done right, and this isn't sophisticated, it's just an angle you toss it in at, you get about 20% of that matter turned into energy that comes out. It's in gamma rays, so you don't really want to set up a planet next to it, like in a certain film I won't mention, but you could convert that into energy easy enough. We already do. That's how suns get powered anyway. Now, what falls in that black hole, you have to wait until it evaporates to get back. But the stuff that's right near the edge, that you get right away. And, it's 20% efficiency versus 1% or less that you get from stars.
Wow.
Generally, most of the bigger ones run at like 0.1% or 1% of 1%. So it's very efficient. And it's really simple. You think of a black hole power reactor, it sounds like something really advanced from Star Trek you'd never have happening. The kind of things that even the really advanced civilizations can't do, but it's actually really easy. It's just not getting killed in the process of doing it, but that's mostly actually not as hard as people tend to think either. It's really hard to fall into black holes. The original Disney movie really messed that up. You are much safer near a black hole than you are near a star.
Right. What Disney movie?
Oh, The Black Hole.
Oh,
from the 1970s.
I never even heard of it.
That's actually where the name came from. We used to call them black stars or dark stars before that, and they called it the black hole, and it stuck. I think Archibald Wheeler or John Archibald Wheeler kind of called it that too.
Once you're in their sort of orbit, though, that's it, isn't it? You're screwed.
No, if you're in orbit, like anything else, if you're in orbit around it, if you have enough velocity, you can leave. And if you are in orbit around something, that means your velocity is stable. You'd slowly decay with time if you didn't do anything. But to actually fall into a black hole, you almost have to run right into it, because otherwise you will go into a stable orbit around it, even a very elliptical one. The accretion disk is that area close enough to it that there's a collection of matter dense enough for things to run into and slow down. As they start slowing down, they're air braking, just like you do in an atmosphere. That's when they crash into it. But, to do that, like our sun, if it turned into a black hole, would have an event horizon about 3 kilometers wide. And we ourselves wouldn't want to be within maybe 1,000 kilometers of it, maybe a little bit further, because the gravity would be kind of heavy on us there. But you can't be within 1,000,000 kilometers of sun without dying instantly. So you would be safer near our sun if it turned into a black hole than
wow.
you would be near a black hole. Yeah, it's weird.
That's fascinating. What about beyond black holes? Because we're talking about 1 trillion years time. Presumably someone might have come up with some sort of other energy source beyond nature.
I hope so. Although my usual thought is, if you're in a black hole civilization, the assumption is that you've already been researching stuff for billions of years, and we've only been researching things for a few centuries, and with just a few, million of us to actually work on that. Whereas these galactic empires presumably have trillions upon trillions of scientists working for billions of years. So if there's a way to get around entropy, they figured it out already by the time at that point. And there are, there are a lot of options. You may not be able to get energy violation in our own universe, but dark energy, for instance, violates energy conservation. The expansion of the universe violates energy conservation. And we knew about that back, before most people knew there was energy conservation. We already knew that it was violated in a few cases. That's the core of general relativity from Einstein, is energy is only conserved in certain contexts. And so if it isn't necessarily stuck, and again, the universe came from someplace in the first place, the Big Bang violates entropy and conservation, probably. Since we don't know what came before, we don't really know that to be true. But maybe you can set off local ones, maybe, which might not be a horrible idea. Maybe you can open up a wormhole to another universe and suck energy out of it. Maybe you can open up a wormhole to a younger universe and move there. But that's a Fermi Paradox example, because if I could open up a gateway to a new universe, then why didn't whoever made our universe in the same way do that originally and colonize the whole thing before we ever came into existence? And there was one option we looked at in an episode, It Is in Civilization at the time, The Big Rip, that actually looks at the idea of the universe being torn apart by effectively a vast number of these, and how you might actually hide inside a black hole to survive that. And you'd be appearing in an inflationary epoch of a new Big Bang, so you actually couldn't colonize your whole universe. And most of the space around you would be faster than your ships could ever get to. They'd be going away. So you could have a huge galactic empire in this new universe, but most of the new universe would be well outside your reach and have to evolve normally. So there are all sorts of strange options, though, available if science goes certain ways on predictions, but we don't know enough yet for so many of those. They're very theoretical and iffy. Like string theory gives us lots of options for surviving these things too, as well as whole new ways to destroy universes.
Okay, so we can get past the black hole, so we can live trillions of years. Now we've got to live just ourselves. I've interviewed a few people who are sort of biohacking or into sort of biology in terms of making us live forever. Then a lot of people tend to be quite pessimistic about that actually happening in our lifetimes, but some people say it could. But then someone came up or said, I'm sure you've heard this before, but a good idea would be to get us into some sort of virtual reality where we can slow down our sense of time to such an extent that it feels like you're living forever. Is that possible?
I borrowed the term frame jacking from a friend of mine, Dennis Taylor, who writes the Barbavorce series, where the guy involved is actually an uploaded human consciousness. And that's where you speed up your subjective awareness of time. Either moves very fast or very slow, depending on which you prefer, which is great for space travel because you can then slow it down during the boring bits and speed it up when you want to dodge bullets, as it were. And that's definitely, I'd say, we call that speed superintelligence. It's one of the three categorized types of superintelligence that we get from Nick Bostrom, very big futurist philosopher. The other two types are network intelligence, that's just like a hive mind, although that's not the only example of it, and quality superintelligence, which is always hard to explain or understand. We use the example that 10 monkeys is not smarter than one human, and that's an example of quality superintelligence, even though they have more brains than we do. But the idea they are being people ask me, Isaac, you're a futurist. What technology would you most like to see discovered in your own lifetime? And I always tell them life extension technology, because I'd like to see more of these things down the road. And there's the option for freezing people and bringing them back potentially too. And these are all things that could happen in our lifetimes very easily, but also could not. It's so hard to guess how technology progresses. I think there are people who are born alive nowadays. They might be 1 year old, or they might be hopefully older than me, who will live to see a day when people do not die of aging normally. We call it the takeoff speed, is when you start extending people's lives faster than they age. And Aubrey de Grey, who most people know from the SENS Research Institute for Aging, actually most people know him as the guy with a really big beard, but the other player was ZZ Top. But he had said to me one time when we were talking was, all medicine is life extension technology. All medicine is. And I could make the argument that pretty much all technology to some degree is. We have made so many little progress on that. And people say, well, we haven't figured out how to reverse aging. It's like, well, no, what we mostly figured out is that aging is kind of this blanket term that we made up. There was like 7 or 8 different ways we know of that we slowly age by that are completely unrelated or partially related to each other. From whether how your body gets worse at getting rid of garbage to telomere issues, and any of those things can kill you with time. And one of them will usually get you. There might be other things that would get us like 300 or 400 years that just we don't even see yet because nobody lives that long. But as we get better at fixing a lot of these things, whether it's through cybernetics or genetics or freezing people or uploading them, lifespans are going to get longer. And This is actually the last few years been the first time in decades that's actually gone down. It was only a little bit, like a few months as an average life expectancy. And again, what the official main reason was, I think it might have been depression and suicide cases. COVID was hard on people. We're only starting to realize how hard. But it will go back up again, and it will start rising again. And it's been rising by about 1 year for every 6. If that trend continues, and that was most of the last century, if that trend continues, then in 60 years, everyone's going to live 10 years longer than the average right now is. When I was a kid, very few people lived to be 90. It's twice as many people live to be 90 now than when I was a kid. And we expect that to grow to be 10% by the year 2050 without any technological advances.
I've heard though. I've heard that those stats are often misleading, because what it really means is we're curing illnesses that might kill toddlers and babies and fetuses.
In some cases, yeah. When you look at the ones who comparing lifespans of people who lived 3 centuries ago, absolutely, yeah. Yes, the fact that most of us live to be adults is not really proof now that we age slower, but other parts are not. Like a lot of it is. We're covering down on all the little ailments that get people, so that now cancer is what gets most people. Great, cancer got most people in the past. It couldn't because they died from something else. But again, there is nothing. Here's things say the maximum age you could live to is 120. That was one of those things that just started getting said one day. Kind of like the idea that you only use 15% of your brain. There's no known maximum age. It's just no one's lived past that. All these little things that slowly kill us. We get better at fixing them here and there, and it raises the average lifespan. And I don't care why it's going up. It's just that it's going up. Now, that might mean that everybody lives to the age of 110 and nobody makes it past 120. I don't think that's exactly how that will work out. But if that's the case, think about if everyone's living in pretty good health into their first century. So you got people who are brilliant biologists and medical doctors who have an 80-year-long career of research. I feel like they could probably help with that, to further advance that. And that's what we're talking, that kind of snowball effect. Same for a lot of the sciences. But these too come with problems. We have to look at that in other episodes. Like, what do you do in a civilization where everybody lives to be 500? And people who say things like, well, we think it might be time to promote you. You've been working good for us for a century, so you're no longer the entry clerk. Now you're the novice assistant sub-clerk. Congratulations. Another 200 years, you'll be running this department of 10 people.
I suppose the other side to that as well is that there's some suggestion you need to it's good that certain generations die because they get stuck in their ideas and things. You look at musicians and things; they have their best work often in their 20s and 30s when they're younger.
A lot of times that's because their liver or kidneys have gone out on them by the time they're 40.
That's true as well. We're out of time, but I haven't asked Ray J's question, so I need a yes or a no. If life-extending tech was invented, do you think it would be available to everyone or reserved for the elitists?
Absolutely. We have an episode explaining why that should probably be the case, as opposed to why it would actually be beneficial to keep it to themselves.
Okay, well then Ray J can check that out. Everyone can check that out. Where can they find your channel, Isaac?
It's on YouTube at just Isaac Arthur, Science and Futurism with Isaac Arthur. But if you search for either, you'll come right to it. And we have about 400 some episodes. We're also available audio only on SoundCloud, Spotify, iTunes, and a bunch of other ones. You can also, if you're not a YouTuber, find us on Rumble as well. So
fantastic. Everyone go check that out. Support our guests. Isaac, thank you so much. It was a pleasure talking to you. I've learned more than I've probably learned ever in about an hour. So it's been brilliant. Thank you
so much for having me on.